Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, where we take up important articles of the day from the newspaper and discuss them in detail as per the demands of Civil Services exam. Articles covered today are displayed on your screen and their notes in PDF and Word format are provided in the description box down below. Without further ado, let us begin.
Now starting off our today's discussion with the first article of the day that appeared on page 12 of today's Hindu newspaper. This article reports that the Law Minister informed Rajya Sabha that the Women Reservation Bill will only be brought after a consensus is achieved among all political parties in the country. Now, reservation for women in legislature is important because it will increase the level of women participation in lawmaking process in the country. It is also important from GS Paper 1 perspective, which mentions the role of women. Further, increased participation of women will alter the structure of legislature in the country. Hence, this topic is also important from GS Paper 2 perspective. Further, a question appeared in mains of the year 2019, which asks us to assess the impact of reservation of seats for women in institutions of local self-government. Further, matter of reservation is also important from prelims point of view, which is apparent from this PYQ of the year 2023 on reservation under Article 16, subsection 4. Hence, in the scope of today's discussion, we'll first cover the need for women reservation in legislature. Then we will discuss arguments both in support and against such reservations. In the end, we will discuss alternatives to reservation in addition to discussing a way forward. Hence, let us start off our today's discussion with the need for women reservation legislatures. Now, why is there a need to bring reservation for women in legislature? Now, India ranks in the bottom quarter among UN member nations in terms of proportion of elected women representatives in the parliament. Now, there are 78 women MPs in 17th Lok Sabha, which comes at around 14% of total strength. Now, it is to be noted that the percentage of women MPs have increased over the years. However, it is still low when you compare this number with representation in other countries. For example, Bangladesh, it sees around 20% of women legislators, whereas Nepal, it has 30% of women who are members of their parliament. Hence, there is a need to increase women participation in Indian parliament. Further, the Global Gender Gap Report of the year 2021, it highlighted that there has been a decline in number of women ministers in India, which was 23.1% in the year of 2019 and it has decreased to 9.1% in the year of 2021. And this number is also way short of international average, which comes at around 22% of women ministers. Now, development in India, it has been severely hampered by the breadth of gender gap and limited female participation, which is in traditionally male-dominating institutions. Hence, increasing the participation of women in parliament can be a way forward. Also, the Constitution of India, it provides for several provisions for women's political empowerment. For example, Article 15 subsection 3, it empowers the state to make special provisions which can be legislative or otherwise in order to secure women's socio-political advancement. Further, Article 325 of the Constitution, it guarantees equal rights for both sexes and entitles the women to enjoy economic, social, cultural and political rights which will be on equal footing with men. Further, India has acceded to several international agreements as well, which supports proactive state measures for women's political development. The Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, also known as CEDAW, it was ratified by India in the year of 1993. And this convention, it provides appropriate measures which includes legislation in order to ensure the full advancement of women and to eliminate discrimination among women in political and public life. Further, the Beijing Platform for Action of their 1995, it endorses affirmative action for women in political spheres in order to achieve democratic transformation, women empowerment, and achieving the goals of sustainable development. Now that we have identified the need for women reservation in legislature, let us discuss the arguments both in support and against such a legislation. Now there are few arguments that supports bringing of women reservation in legislatures. The first argument is that reservation for women is essential for achieving political participation of women, and such a measure will help women fight abuse, discrimination and inequality. Also, women reservation is critical for sustainable progress against human development indicators. The second need is that women reservation ensures political participation of women in society, which is essential for building a functioning and representative democracy. Further, women political participation can provide inspiration for women, and it will enable them to take action for a better and more equal society, and it will help them make meaningful contribution towards our inclusive national developmental goals. Additionally, women reservation is intrinsic to eliminate gender discrimination and strengthening the women's empowerment as enshrined by fundamental right to equality and freedom, which is provided in the preamble and constitution of India. Further, reservation for women in panchayats has resulted into an encouraging experience. Now gram panchayats with elected women leaders, they have invested more in public goods and have become closely linked to women's concern. And this has resulted into subsequent increase in percentage of female local leaders who contest and win elections. Improvement in human developmental indicators, making democracy more representative, proving to be an inspiration for other women, strengthening women's empowerment, and an encouraging experience in panchayats, all arguments they support women reservation in legislatures. However, there are few arguments that are against women reservation in legislatures. Let us find out these arguments in the next slide. Now, the first argument that is against bringing women reservation in India is that it will further the unequal status of women, as then women will not be perceived to be competing on merit, and hence it will perpetuate their unequal status in the society. Further, reservation for women will help women who come from elite circles, and it will help them gain political power, which will further aggravate the plight of poor and deprived women in the society. Also, bringing women reservation in legislature would mean that there would be a rotation of reserved constituencies, and this rotation may reduce the incentive for current MPs to work in his constituency, as these male MPs they might be ineligible to seek re-election from that constituency itself. Further, women reservation will perpetuate the proxy culture. For example, there is a concept called Sarpanch Pati, which is when a woman who is elected on the seat does not have the real power, and a male decision maker acts on her behalf. A similar situation can also be problematic for women MPs who might get elected from reserved constituencies. Further, provisions for women reservation will divert attention from larger issues in the political sphere, such as criminalization of politics and inner party democracy. Also, reservation for women in legislature would mean that deserving candidates who might be male, they may eventually be not allowed to contest elections from their preferable constituencies. Now that we have discussed arguments both in support and against women reservation, let us discuss few alternatives that might be taken in order to increase women participation in legislatures. An alternative to women's reservation is the idea of ensuring reservation within political parties, as countries such as Canada, United Kingdom, France and Sweden, they reserve seats for women within political parties, but they do not have quotas for women in their parliament. Further, the Election Commission of India, it has suggested a candidate quotas for women which will be at party level, and it will require only an ordinary amendment to the Representation of People Act of 1951. Further, there's another alternative, which is by introducing dual member constituencies, which means that constituencies, instead of reserving seats for women, will nominate two members, among which one can be women. However, lack of rigorous evidence on the efficacy of these alternatives has limited the scope for adoption of these practices worldwide. Hence, women reservation in legislature is seen as a viable alternative. Further, it requires both political commitment and rigorous evidence, which will be necessary to deliberate and debate on such a legislation, and it will ensure that the passage in Parliament of such a bill will bridge critical gender gaps in both political and legislative decision making. Further, strategies are required in order to bring change in the male dominated value system in the society, in addition to organizing awareness and leadership development programs for women, which will be essential to boost their confidence, and hence these policies must be implemented in addition to women reservation for increasing the women's participation in Indian politics. Hence, there is a need for enhanced political commitment, bringing change in male dominated value system, and bringing an awareness and leadership developmental programs for women participants is essential to increase the women's participation in politics in addition to provisions of women reservation. This will ensure that the Indian democracy becomes much more representative of its demography. This was all for today's discussion on women reservation. Now moving on to the second article of the day that appeared on page 14 of today's Hindu newspaper. This article highlights that the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Social Justice and Empowerment, it pulled up the government as the government currently does not have an accurate count of population of persons with disability. Now, persons with disability, they constitute a vulnerable section in our Indian society. Hence, it is important from GS Paper 2 perspective. Further, in the mains of the year 2016, a question appeared on Rights of Persons with Disability Act of the year 2016. Also, vulnerable sections are important from prelims point of view, which is apparent from this PYQ of the year 2019 on particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Hence, in the scope of today's discussion, we will first take a look at who are persons of disability. Further, we will also discuss challenges that persons of disability face. In addition, we will also discuss initiatives that are taken by Government of India for socio-economic empowerment of persons with disability. In the end, we will discuss a way forward for measures in order to enhance the quality of life of persons with disability. Now, a person with disability means that a person who has a long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairment which hinders his full and effective participation in the society. Now, the last data which highlights the population of persons with disability in the country was from census of the year 2011. It highlighted that there are 2.68 crores of persons with disability, which constitute of 2.21% of nation's total population. Among the disabled population, 56% of them are males, whereas rest 44% were females. Now a significant portion, that is 69% of disabled population, they live in rural areas. Further, 54% of disabled children who have multiple disabilities, they have never attended an educational institution. Additionally, 50% of children who have mental illness, they have never attended an educational institution. Therefore, persons with disability form a vulnerable population. Now in the next slide, we will cover challenges that persons with disability are subjected to. The first challenge that a person with disability encounters in the Indian society is that of attitudinal barriers. As persons who are disabled, they are subjected to stereotyping, face stigma, prejudice, and discrimination in the society. Further, they are also subjected to few social barriers. As of total disabled population in the country, only about 55% of them are literates. Further, at all India level, only 36% of persons who are disabled are engaged in some kind of employment. And those who are employed, they face issues that are related to access to and within workplace. Further, they are subjected to harassment and discrimination at work and also face lack of positive attitudes toward persons with disability. In addition, children who are disabled, they are 4 times more likely to experience violence than children who are without disability. Hence, these highlight the types of social barriers that a person with disability faces. In addition, disability and poverty have a reinforcing relationship, as poor health, nutrition, poor living condition, and lack of given care to pregnant mothers can lead to disability. Equally, the onset of disability can have an adverse effect on education, employment, and earnings, which will then result into higher rates of poverty. In addition, there has been policy barriers as well, as current programs and activities of the government are not relatively accessible to persons of disability. Further, there have been barriers to healthcare and assistive technologies as well, which includes prohibitive cost, limited availability of health services, physical barriers, and inadequate skills and knowledge of health workers. There's an estimate that only about 5 to 15% of population who are disabled, they have access to assistive technologies. Further, persons of disability, they also face accessibility issues, which can be in terms of poor design and construction of facilities that prevents persons of disability from going to school, hospital, markets, or gaining access to services. Further, public areas such as footpaths, parks, and public transportation may also be inaccessible to persons with physical disability. Lastly, persons with disability they also face communication hurdles. As disabilities, they affect a person's hearing, speaking, reading, writing skills, and this further creates challenges for persons with physical disability. Now, the government of India has taken a few initiatives that were taken in order to empower the persons who have disabilities. What are these initiatives? Let us find out in the next slide. The first initiative pertains to legislative measures, as the Government of India enacted the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act in the year of 2016. This act provided reservation for persons with disability in government jobs, and recently this reservation was increased from 3% to 4%. Further, a child who is disabled has a right to free education between 6 to 18 years. Further, government also provides 5% of reservation in seats in government or government aided higher educational institutions to persons who are physically disabled. Now, additionally, the government of India it has acceded to few international conventions as well. The first is United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was ratified in the year of 2006. Additionally, Government of India has also adopted the Ancient Strategy, which provides for certain rights for persons with disability in the area of Asia and Asia Pacific. Further, Government of India is also a signatory to Bivako Millennium Framework, which works towards an inclusive and barrier-free and right-based society for persons with disability. In addition to these legislative and convention-based measures, Government of India has also introduced a Sugamya Bharat Abhiyan, which is there to enhance the accessibility of built environment, transportation system, and information and communication ecosystem. Further, government has also undertaken skill development programs for persons with disability. In addition, Government of India has also provided for establishment of an early diagnostic and intervention system at district headquarters or other places who has governmental medical colleges. The most important development in this area pertains to unique ID for persons with disability, as this project is being implemented with a view to create a national database for persons with disability. Recently, the Department of Empowerment of Persons with Disability it made it mandatory for all states and union territories to grant certificates to persons who are disabled using an online mode only. And a disability certificate, it is a necessity for persons with disability as it will help them avail benefits of different governmental schemes and they can avail this benefit by furnishing the disability document. Now that we have discussed the initiatives that were taken by Government of India, let us discuss a way forward of measures that can be undertaken in order to make lives of persons with disability somewhat better. The first way forward in this regard pertains to the need for an attitudinal change, as by not considering a disability as a personal deficit or shortcoming, and instead thinking of it as a social responsibility, in which all people can be supported in order to make their lives more independent and full. Further, there is a need to improve access to social protection for persons with physical disability. In addition to disability specific social protection, persons with disability can also provided with access to other programs, which may include child and family allowances, unemployment benefits, and social assistance schemes. Additionally, there is a need for disability inclusion in the healthcare sector, as this will involve access to effective health services, protection during health emergencies, and access to cross sectoral public health interventions such as water, sanitation, and hygiene services. Further, there is a need to establish an early diagnostic and intervention centers, as it can help in primary prevention, that is, prevention of the manifestation of disability, and secondary prevention, which will help reduce the duration or severity of disabilities. Additionally, persons with disability can be provided with assistive technologies, as it will enable them to enhance their functional independence and it will make their daily living tasks more easier. Further, such assistive technologies can help a person to travel or communicate with others, work, and participate in social and recreational activities. Further, there is a need to improve accessibility to persons with disability by specifically considering the needs of people who have disability and building or modifying products, services, and facilities so that it can also be used by persons with all abilities. In the end, there is a need to improve educational and employment opportunities for persons with disability by building accessible classrooms, providing a disabled friendly study material and proper teacher training, identifying work and jobs for disabled persons can incentivize employers to employ disabled workers, etc. Hence, with the help of an attitude change, access to social protection, disability inclusion in the health sector, providing early diagnostic and intervention centers, assistive technologies, and improving accessibility for persons with disability will help persons with disability lead a life which is of better quality. And it will also reduce their exclusion from the Indian society in general. This was all for today's discussion on persons with disabilities. Now moving on to the third article of the day, which appeared in page 8 of today's Hindu newspaper. This article gives a critical overview of Forest Amendment Bill of the year of 2023. Now, Forest Conservation Act of the year 1980, it provides for conservation of forest in India. Further conservation is also important from GS paper 3 perspective, as it mentions environment and biodiversity and its conservation. Also, in the mains of the year 2020, a question appeared on draft environment impact assessment, as such measures are important for conservation of biodiversity. Further, forest cover and its protection are also important from prelims point of view, which can be gauged from this PYQ of the year 2018 on percentage of forest cover with respect to total area of state. Hence, in the scope of today's discussion, we will first try to understand what is a Forest Conservation Act of the year of 1980. Then we will discuss the issues that have been highlighted in today's article with respect to Forest Amendment Bill, which seeks to amend Forest Conservation Act of the year 1980. Hence, let us start off our today's discussion with describing what is a Forest Conservation Act. Now, the Forest Conservation Act, it came into force in order to provide for conservation of forests in India. This act empowers the central government to make rules for carrying out the provision of Forest Conservation Act. Additionally, this act also defines the non-forest purposes, which means breaking up or clearing of any forest land for cultivation of tea, coffee, spices, etc., or for any purpose other than reforestation. However, these non-forest purposes, they do not include work which is related to conservation, development and management of forests and wildlife, such as establishment of checkposts, fire lines, wireless communication and construction of fencing, etc. However, this act prohibits state or any other authorities except with prior approval of central government, and these authorities, they cannot give any order which pertains to dereservation of forest. Further, they cannot also allow use of forest areas for non-forest purposes. Additionally, these authorities, they cannot lease the forest land to any private person or organization. Further, this act also prohibits clearing up of trees which have been grown in naturally forested land. Further, any diversion of land for non-forest purposes, it requires approval under the Forest Conservation Act as well as payment for stipulated compensatory levies such as of net present value and compensatory afforestation, etc. This act also provides for constitution of an advisory committee. As the central government, it may constitute a committee in order to advise the government of the day to grant approval or any other matter which is connected with conservation of forest. This act also provides for penalties for contravention of any provision of the act. In addition, and authorities and government departments are also punishable under the scope of this act. Now, the Forest Conservation Act of the year 1980, it justifiably adopted a rather protectionist stand, which made forest clearances both time consuming and costly to obtain. Hence, in the scope of current developmental needs and priorities, the government, it introduced a Forest Conservation Act Amendment Bill. However, today's article, it highlights few issues in the bill. What are these issues? Let us take a look in the next slide. The first issues that are related with the amendment bill, it pertains to the narrowed definition of forests in such a bill. Earlier, the Supreme Court, in its Godavaran judgment of the year 1996, it extended the scope of Forest Conservation Act and expanded the definition of forest, which may also include areas with trees. However, the present amendment, it significantly restricts the application of Godavaran judgment, as it only enables legally notified forests and forests which are recorded in government records to be notified as forests. However, this amendment bill only enables a legally notified forest and forest which are recorded in government records on or after October the 25th of 1980 to be recorded under the definition of forests. And this change could potentially impact around 28% of India's forest cover, which encompasses more than 2 lakh square kilometers. Further, this bill also leads to exclusion of significant tracts from forest areas. As this bill, it excludes some of the India's most fragile ecosystem, as it removes the need for forest clearances for security related infrastructure, which may be up to 100 kilometers from international borders. And this may endanger globally recognized biodiversity hotspots such as forest in northeast and high altitude Himalayan forests. Further, this bill also grants sanction to additional activities which were regulated earlier. As this bill, it introduces exemption for construction projects such as zoos, safari parks, and ecotourism facilities. As artificially created green areas and animal enclosures are very different from natural ecosystems. However, this bill grants unrestricted powers to union government to specify any desired use beyond those specified in the original act. And such provisions, it may raise legitimate concerns about the potential exploitation of forest resources without adequate environmental scrutiny. Further, this act also disenfranchises the forest people, as it makes no reference to other forest laws. For instance, scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers or Forest Rights Act of the year 2006 finds no mention in this amendment. Instead, it will also mean that forest people institutions will no longer be consulted when there will be an amendment to forest areas. And hence, the issues with this bill regards to narrow definition of forest, exclusion of significant tracts of forest areas, sanctions to activities that were regulated earlier, and it will also further disenfranchise the forest people. This was all for today's discussion on Forest Conservation Act of the year 1980 and its amendment bill. Now moving on to the last article of the day, which appeared on page 2 of today's Hindu newspaper. This article describes autonomy of minority education institutions who come under the Delhi University. Now minorities, they are provided with the fundamental right to establish and administer an educational institution. And such fundamental rights are relevant from GS paper 2 perspective, which highlights Indian Constitution and its features. For the subject of fundamental rights and implementation of constitutional reservation scheme in religious minority institution appeared in mains of the year 2018. Further, fundamental rights is also important from prelims perspective, which is apparent from this PYQ of the year 2021 on right to privacy. Hence, in the scope of today's discussion on minority educational institutions, we will first cover about what is a minority educational institution and protection provided in the Constitution to such institutions. Further, we will also discuss the rights that are available to such institution in addition to Supreme Court judgments who has provided with certain clarification on rights to minority educational institutions. Hence, let us start off our today's discussion on what are minority educational institutions. Now the term minority, it has not been defined by the Constitution of India. However, Government of India through its notification has notified 6 communities as religious minority communities. These are Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Parsis and Jains. Now minority educational institutions are institutions who are established to protect and promote unique culture and traditions of such minority groups. And these protections are available to both religious and linguistic minorities. As Constitution in its Article 30, it provides for linguistic and religious minorities a fundamental right to establish and administer an educational institution of their choice. Further, Article 30, subsection 2, it prohibits the state in discriminating against a minority in terms of granting aid. Now, there are few eligibility criteria that an institution has to fulfill in order to be categorized as a minority educational institution. First, such an institution needs to be administered and established by a minority community. Further, such institution needs to be run by a trust or a registered society in which majority of members fall from such minority communities. Also, such institution needs to be established for benefits of minority section. Only after an institution can fulfill these three criteria, then only it can be categorized as a minority educational institution. Now, what are the rights that are provided to such minority educational institutions? Let us find out in the next slide. The first right that are provided to minority educational institutions pertains to control over their representatives. As Article 30, it provides for substantially more power to such minority educational institution with respect to control over representatives. Further, minority educational institution, they remain outside the purview of Article 15, which deals with reservation policy of the state. However, these minority educational institutions, they can provide reservation up to 50% for students who come from their own community. Further, as per Article 30, a due compensation, it needs to be provided to the minority educational institution in case of compulsory takeover by the state. Further, Section 12 or Right to Education Act, it provides for 25% reservation for economically weaker section. However, such provisions are not applicable to minority educational institutions. However, Supreme Court, it has held that minority schools, they have to grant a free admission to poor children for 25% of their seats. Additionally, minority educational institution can have a separate fee structure. However, they are not allowed to charge capitation fees. Now that we have discussed rights that are available to minority educational institutions, let us take a look at two Supreme Court judgments who have further clarified the rights that are available to such minority educational institutions. The first important case in this regard is TMA Pai versus State of Karnataka case of the year 2002. In this judgment, the Supreme Court held that the fundamental rights which are available to minority educational institutions under Article 30 are neither absolute nor above the law. Further, if a regulation is framed in national interest, it is applicable to all educational institutions, which also include minority educational institutions. But such regulations, they cannot destroy the minority character of such institutions. Further, regulation of unaided minority educational institution for ensuring excellence by state is permissible. Further, percentage of non-minority admissions that are taken by such institutions are to be decided by state or university concerned. And this particular provision is subject of discussion in today's news article. Additionally, there was a second case also, which was Islamic Academy of Education versus State of Karnataka case of the year 2003. In this case, the Supreme Court, it clarified its judgment in TMA Pai case. The ruling of the Supreme Court, it said that the Article 30, it confers linguistic and religious minorities the unqualified right to establish and administer an educational institution. However, the government, it can exercise control and regulation over these institutions in order to maintain good standards. Hence, this was all for today's short discussion on minority educational institutions.